My enthusiasm around blockchain really is based on the fact that I believe that blockchain is going to do for value exchange what the internet did for information exchange. So if you can think of what happened since the early 90s, late 80s or early 90s, and what the internet did for the way we communicate, it literally made the world smaller. So we communicate in some very different ways now, and we communicate in almost near real time. Something like that has not existed for value exchange. And I think blockchain is the thing that will make that change happen. Whenever I do this presentation, there's one thing I always do, and I say to the audience whenever there's one thing I would love you to walk away from this presentation knowing, right, is that there is a difference between blockchain and cryptocurrency, right? Blockchain is not Bitcoin. All right. So if you leave here with one piece of knowledge after I'm finished, just know that blockchain is not Bitcoin, right? Blockchain just so happens to be technology that underpins Bitcoin. So understand how all this stuff came about. I'm just going to go through a little history of blockchain and the whole age of digital currency, right? And to do that, we kind of have to go back to when things in form of currency and exchange started, right? So, when you look at, going as far back as bartering in 9000 BC, coming up to where, they minted the first coins, and then we started to look at the gold standard. Then, shifting, in the 1940s to the Bretton Woods system, which then went to be known as fiat currency. Through all of that time, we have always been working with something that you could touch and feel, whether it was coins or physical. In the barter system, you're exchanging physical goods. Even up to Bretton Woods system, where the greenback was the currency that everything was pegged against, and then gold. For that entire period of time, we were always trading things or exchanging things that we could touch and feel. But then something happened in 2008. The massive financial meltdown, and a lot of people started to get really antsy about these frameworks and systems you had in place. And the thought was that, look, if we, start to use technology, go digital, we would be able to, solve or mitigate some of those problems associated with what happened in that big financial crash, right? So really what you saw happening here is we're going from barter all the way through to paper money, to plastic, then to electronic money. And one of the things that we started to learn and understand was the things you could do with a tangible instrument like a paper dollar or a coin. Suddenly you couldn't do the same thing when you went digital, because electronic or digital assets are very different. They're very portable. You can move them around at the speed of light. And as a result, you can do many interesting, good and bad things when you're exchanging them. So in the light of that, how do you ensure that you can move around and exchange this, electronic or digital tangible in such a way that it works just like what we're used to, right? And it turns out that one of the biggest problems we had to face was this thing called integrity, right? And integrity was in the form of this thing called double spend, because in the digital space, I could exchange something with you in the digital space. You would give me something back, but because it's digital, I could easily, do something to take back that digital portion that I gave to you, while still keeping what you gave me, right? Because it's just code, right? So that was the real problem about doing exchanges in the digital space, and there needed to be something that would allow exchange of digital assets, given all of the challenges with exchanging stuff in the digital space. And there had to be something that would actually allow for trustworthy and trusted exchange of digital assets. Now, I was doing this same presentation at the university, and one of the questions I asked audience is, well, look, when you go and buy something on Amazon.com, how do you know you're going to get it? Right? Because and the reason you buy things on Amazon and have the warm and fuzzy that you're going to get it is because you trust it. And the reason you trust it is there are things in place that make sure that if something happens to that transaction, you have some sort of recourse. So in the typical fiat system that has existed for a long time, your recourse is the fact that between you and the person that you're exchanging a good or a service with for your money, there is some sort of middleman, bank, or in some cases in e-commerce, the store, like Amazon. So there's always somebody in the middle doing things, and that is what breeds the trust that you have in these things. Now, how do you ensure that that level of trust exists when there is no middleman? Because that is what exchanging digital assets in this kind of space will do. It can potentially eliminate the need for that middleman. So how do you ensure that that same trust that exists with the way we do stuff now would exist with no middleman, right? So it turns out the problem has existed for a very long time. In fact, most people think that blockchain just came about in 2008 or 2009, but it actually has been around for a lot longer than that, as far back as in the 1990s. And it really only came to prominence in 2008. So as far back as 1991, you guys here at Sternetta, they wanted to figure out a way to make sure that if somebody put their signature on a document, on an electronic document, that once that is done, the document would never get changed. And if the document was changed, a whole bunch of red flags would go up, and the signatures on the document would no longer be valid. Now, a lot of you guys know this because it is so easy for you to just take a Word document, scan your signature, put it on a document, perhaps make it a PDF, and, off you go. But the fact of the matter is, when you do that, somebody can actually take that document, make changes to it, right? And your signature is still there. So how do you ensure that when you sign that document in that electronic or digital form, that no further changes can be made? So that, a man don't change up a contract on you and say, like, look, you signed it, so this is what you signed to. So that was the initial, start of, okay, how do you do that? How do you ensure that in the digital space, the integrity of the transaction that occurs is held? All right. So these guys, they started the work back in the early 90s on how to do that. And then a little later on in 2008, when they had the financial crash, a paper emerged about, a lot of people got very upset about what happened in that financial crash. And a paper emerged from an entity, and I'm calling it an entity deliberately because the author of the paper is a person called Satoshi Nakamoto, but it's not one person, okay? It's a group of people. And that paper spoke to an entirely new way of exchanging money, and it was called Bitcoin. All right, that was the name of the paper. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. That the whole idea behind that was how would you now go about exchanging, value, goods, services, assets entirely in the digital domain without the need for any intermediary. So going back to the days of barter, when if I have a cow and you have a goat, and the value of each makes sense for us to exchange, we just exchange it. No middleman. All right. So if you think about it, you're like doing a digitization of the barter system, right? Where I can now exchange digital goods or goods with you one-on-one directly without the need for a bank or perhaps an insurance company, depending on the kind of transaction. No middleman. What do you have to do to make that kind of thing happen? And the paper they came out with was the peer-to-peer electronic cash system, because they were looking at how you could do this with money. And that was the genesis of what you know today as Bitcoin, because it's a very clever name, right? Bit, which really speaks to the ones and zeros in digital space. But what they wanted to do was to kind of hash out how that would be possible. And what they determined was the biggest problem that existed that needed to be solved was that of double spend. All right. And I'm going to talk a little bit about double spend a little later. But the idea was, how do I ensure that once you give me something in the digital space and I give you something in return, that you can't take it back or I can't take it back from you, right? And that's the real challenge in the digital space, all right? So if you think about downloading music, or downloading files on the internet, we don't think about it often, but suppose you went and bought a PDF document online, you download it to your computer and you pay for it. And then the next day you go back to your computer, it's no longer there and you can't download it. The person you bought it from has the money and they still have the document, but you don't. That's the kind of stuff that can happen in the digital domain. How do you stop that? How do you ensure that that doesn't happen? All right. And if you expand that to any digital asset, what has to be in place to make that happen? And it turns out that what was outlined in this revolutionary document was the technology that we know as blockchain. And it turns out that blockchain is the technology that solves that problem. All right.